Hello, good evening and welcome everybody. Delighted to see so many of you here this evening in the Rothenberg Hall for the next in our series of Research Division Public Lectures in the Humanities. Thank you all for coming. My name is Steve Hindle. I'm Director of Research here at the Huntington. Thank you for the vote of confidence. I look after the fellowship program and the conference program and the lecture program. One of the wonderful things about being Director of Research in this institution is that I get the opportunity, in consultation with my colleagues, to bring to the Huntington every year a number of very distinguished scholars in their own field who we hope will make a major research contribution but will also exercise intellectual leadership in the scholarly community that orbits around our collections. There are 5 or 6 of these fellowships by invitation every year, and one of them is the Fletcher Jones Foundation, which is usually awarded to a scholar who works in British history or British literature. And previous holders of this fellowship have included Professors Markku Peltonen, Margot Todd, Norman Jones, Fran Dolan, and Naomi Tadmore. I'm really thrilled that Dympna Callaghan from Syracuse University accepted our invitation to hold the Fletcher Jones this year, because it's difficult to imagine a scholar who's made a more significant contribution to the study of Shakespeare's poetry, and especially the role of women in Shakespearean drama. It's my pleasure to introduce her to you this evening. She is Professor of Modern Letters in the Department of English at Syracuse, where she's taught since 1990. She holds her BA in English Literature from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England, 2 MAs, one in American Studies from Bowling Green State, and one in Renaissance Literature from the University of Sussex, and her DPhil, her doctorate, is from Sussex University as well. She's held numerous fellowships across the world, including at the Newberry Library, the Folger Shakespeare Library, the Arts and Humanities Centre at Bogliasco in Italy, fellowships at both Hughes Hall and Clare Hall within the University of Cambridge, hurrah, University of Auckland, New Zealand, the Getty Research Institute here in LA, and several times here at the Huntington. She's the author of numerous volumes on women, gender and tragedy in the early modern period. Women and Gender in Renaissance Tragedy, a study of Othello, King Lear and the Duchess of Malfi and the White Devil, which appeared in 1989. The Feminist Companion to Shakespeare in 2000, which was a Choice Award-winning book. Shakespeare Without Women, which appeared in 2000. The Impact of Feminism in English Renaissance Studies, 2007. Shakespeare's Sonnets, 2007. And most recently, Who Was William Shakespeare? An Introduction to the Life and Works. And her study of reading Shakespeare's poetry is forthcoming. She's also edited several and co-edited several collections and edited critical editions of Webster's Duchess of Malfi, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, The Taming of the Shrew, and Hamlet. We're delighted to have her in residence here at the Huntington this year, working on a project entitled Shakespeare's Freeness of Speech. And it is from that project that tonight's talk is derived. To discuss how he must hold his tongue, please welcome Professor Dympna Callaghan.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Steve, for that very generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out. It's really nice to see everybody, and I'm really honored to be here. I've been thinking a lot this week about how we distinguish between freedom of speech and an assault on the truth. And I think that question has become more urgent and ideologically inflected of late. And I can't hope or even begin to answer it. But what I would like to do tonight is to show that questions around freedom of speech have been with us for a very long time, and that they were as significant to Shakespeare as they are to us. Shakespeare's freedom of speech. Let us be jocund, will you troll the catch you taught me but while ere? Come on, Trinculo, let us sing, Flautum and Cautum, and Scoutum and Flautum, thought is free. Thought is free is the dissident refrain of a song in The Tempest, urging the mockery and derision of authority, the flouting, couting, and scouting of it. In this jubilant moment, the assembled characters revel in their plot to assassinate Prospero, the colonist and ruler of the isle. That sedition is not spoken here, but rather celebrated in a rollicking song or troll, makes it potentially less threatening. Thus, the audience need not fear that The Tempest, which is listed as a comedy in the first folio, and is a play in which everyone survives, is going to turn suddenly into the tragedy of Macbeth, where the ruler is actually killed. Thought is free was a common proverb. Shakespeare used it in Twelfth Night as well as The Tempest. He used it as well in Othello and Measure for Measure. The catch or round in The Tempest requires the three voices to sing the same song beginning at different times, like Three Blind Mice, so that the final line is repeated 3 times by the singers. Thought is free, thought is free, thought is free. The irony here is that in early modern England, it really wasn't. And this will be the burden of my song tonight, because I want to explore the paradox that the greatest writer in the history of English literature lived in a world where, although both eloquence and plain speaking were prized, there were nonetheless formidable restrictions on what kinds of thoughts could be expressed. While we might assume that poetic license, an expression used in England since the 14th century, would get literature off the hook in terms of what could be written, that term did not mean that poets were entitled to say anything. It meant only that they had the imaginative freedom to depart from history and fact. Further, the prerogative to exercise liberty of conscience, specifically in relation to religious belief, was not established in English law at this time. Historically, of course, it was not only heretical thought that was regarded as dangerous, but a whole range of ideas and opinions that might be deemed immoral or seditious and a threat to political and social stability. Ironically, then, thought was free as long as it stayed put in the head. But one of the problems with thought is that our ideas and beliefs are rarely hermetically sealed within the brain, forever confined in the privacy of our own minds. Rather, thought tends to escape, in the first instance as speech, and perhaps subsequently as action. In other words, thoughts almost invariably lead to other things. Even Elizabeth I, who famously said she didn't wish to make windows into men's souls, nonetheless lived in constant fear of those subjects who might be persuaded that their true allegiance was not to her, but to the Pope in Rome. Early modern clergy, too, often stressed the limits of freedom of thought. For example, Gervase Babington expounded the meaning of the 10th commandment. You remember that one? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, etc., as the sin of thought rather than deed. Babington opined, a strange doctrine, no doubt, to many who think their thought is free. Similarly, George Gifford, writing in 1583, observed, the law of God is not as the law of princes, that a man can say thought is free, but it bindeth as well the inward parts of the mind. Thought, then, might have been free, at least in theory, but speech, both spoken and written, certainly was not. As Cynthia Clegg has shown, the Privy Council, the Bishop of London and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Stationers' Company and the Master of the Revels all worked to police literary production. Interestingly, plays and poems were sometimes censored or suppressed after performance or printing, as well as before it. Shakespeare's contemporary, Ben Jonson, was imprisoned in 1597 for his part in The Isle of Dogs, which allegedly incited a riot. This triggered the Privy Council to issue an order for the demolition of all playhouses, though in the end they were simply shuttered for 3 months. While I'm sure we would all love to know what was in that play that caused such a stir, we don't know because it has not survived, probably because any copies of it were destroyed. Christopher Marlowe, whose greatness, had he lived, would have rivaled Shakespeare's, in my opinion, was stabbed to death in a tavern at the age of only 29 in 1593, likely at the government's behest. and his translation of Ovid's erotic elegies was burnt on episcopal orders in 1599. Shakespeare's colleague in the Lord Chamberlain's company, the actor Augustine Phillips, was hauled before the Privy Council in February of 1601. His crime was to have performed what was by then an old play about deposing a weak monarch. That play was Shakespeare's Richard II. While the play had already been censored in print and perhaps in performance, it posed a new problem in 1601, because this time Phillips and his fellow actors had accepted a commission to stage the play the night before the ill-fated rebellion of the Earl of Essex. Queen Elizabeth is reported to have said, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" Another example of the restrictions writers had to contend with is to be found in relation to Shakespeare's As You Like It, which refers explicitly to attempts on the part of the authorities to suppress plays and poetry. Since the little wit that fools have was silenced, the little foolery that wise men have makes a great show. This is either a reference to what is known as the bishop's ban, that is the decree of June 1599 by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London, prohibiting the print publication of satires and epigrams, or the silencing referred to here may be to the repeated attempts on the part of the City of London authorities to suppress theatre. As You Like It, a perennially popular play, celebrates the freedom to be found in the forest, and indeed the character Jaques even declares, "I must have liberty." However, the play also makes pointed reference to both the murder of Christopher Marlowe, who was stabbed to death at Eleanor Bull's tavern in Deptford, allegedly in an altercation over the tab, known in early modern parlance as The Reckoning. In the play, the clown Touchstone says, "When a man's verses cannot be understood, it strikes a man more dead than a great reckoning in a little room." Here, Shakespeare makes a pun on the reckoning as the bill and the idea of the final reckoning of death and of the last judgment. That Marlowe's assailant was likely in the pay of authorities made the story about his death an implausible account of his murder, a suspicion that is also voiced in As You Like It, when Shakespeare makes a further pun on reckoning as account, both in the sense of the amount owed in a tavern, but also in the sense of the account or report of what transpired there. Celia, who is in the play the lively companion of Rosalind, the cross-dressed heroine, asserts that the oath of a lover is no stronger than the word of a tapster or barkeeper, who is likely to tally the bill to his own advantage. They are both the confirmer of false reckonings. The implication, then, is that the official story of Marlowe's death is false. Shakespeare is sailing pretty close to the wind here. This is, of course, not to suggest that the play is merely an allegory of dark matters. It's not an allegory, and it's in fact very funny. But it is heavily elusive and includes reference to the illicit printing and distribution of documents that were deemed heretical, known as the Marprelate Tracts. This occurs via the character of Oliver Martext, and also by means of jokes about marring poetry manuscript, to whose relentless manuscript publication in the forest, Orlando, the lover of the play, is unshakably committed. So why would Shakespeare believe he could get away with these allusions to delicate and dangerous political matters? Well, importantly, the entire play is set in the Forest of Arden, the green world far away from civilization, where the order of the everyday world is inverted, and thus a woman, the heroine Rosalind, can disguise herself in male attire. This is the topsy-turvy world, or the world upside down, which it is the privilege of comedy to explore. It is a place of licensed misrule, when the order of ordinary life is suspended for a defined and limited period, just like the carnival days celebrated all over early modern Europe. The forest is also what's known as a locus amenus, an idealized safe haven from the dangers and depredations of court life and urban culture. An Arcadia. When the character Amiens sings, "Under the greenwood tree, who loves to lie with me?" he celebrates sexual freedom in the forest. However, there is also potentially an allusion to John Greenwood, who was hanged for printing heretical tracts and whom we know from the records of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, was a companion of Christopher Marlowe's. Marlowe bought him dinner on several occasions. Greenwood was hanged in 1593. In what seems like more than a coincidence, his associate John Penry, who had been engaged in the clandestine operation of a portable printing press in the forest, was hanged the very day before Marlowe was murdered on May 30th, 1593. The allusions charted above are too enmeshed in Elizabethan topicality for us to catch nowadays in performance, but their discovery gives the lie to the still prevalent idea that Shakespeare, more than his contemporaries, played it safe. Certainly, Elizabethan audiences who were avid consumers of news would have been alert to such references. One reference in As You Like It that seems particularly anodyne, totally harmless in fact, is the mention of Shakespeare's favourite poet, Ovid, but it wasn't. The clown Touchstone tells his love interest, the rustic Audrey, that now he is in the forest away from court, he is like honest Ovid among the Goths. Ovid was exiled from Rome to a remote port on the Black Sea in 8 before the Common Era. He had run afoul most spectacularly of the political regime of his day, and everyone in early modern England knew that he had excited imperial opprobrium. His crime, he said, was Carmen et error, a poem and a mistake. The poem is usually thought to be Ars Amatoria, or The Art of Love, about finding sex in the city of Rome. His actual transgression was probably not indecent verse. It was much more likely to have been his sly parody of the emperor in the final book of his greatest poem, The Metamorphoses. Ovid then was the bad boy poet of ancient Rome, eloquent, gifted beyond all measure, and a thorn in the side of the emperor. And according to Francis Mears, writing in 1598, Shakespeare was just like him. The sweet, witty soul of Ovid lives in mellifluous, honey-tongued Shakespeare. Mears here commends the aesthetic qualities, the expressive, metrical fluency of Shakespeare's verse, but when he aligns Shakespeare with Ovid, he inescapably intimates the political dangers of poetic fluency as well. We do not know where or precisely when As You Like It was first performed. It could have been at the Globe, which was safely outside London's city walls to the south of the River Thames, and thus beyond the jurisdiction of the City Fathers. Or it could have been for a special Shrove Tuesday performance at court on February the 20th, 1599. Shrove Tuesday correlates with our Mardi Gras, and it's similarly a period of designated, licensed, carnivalesque misrule, a holiday time when the liberties of a poet-playwright might have been expanded. However, as we have noted, there were in As You Like It a lot of red flags that state and civic authorities might have noticed. And in fact, the play was stayed from publication in 1600. That is, publication was halted. As You Like It did not see print until 1623, when it appeared in the First Folio. That is the collection of Shakespeare's plays assembled by members of Shakespeare's company 7 years after his death. While staying was often a matter of simply delaying publication, frequently as a means of registering an early modern form of copyright with the Stationers' Company, all the other plays stayed for publication in 1600 were printed within a matter of weeks or months. Only As You Like It had to wait 23 years before being printed, 20 years into the reign of James I and 7 years after the death of its author. Thus, staying functioned in this instance as a means of suppressing publication altogether. On the other hand, early modern restrictions on literature did not always function in the way we might expect. Venus and Adonis, Shakespeare's great homage to Ovid, which was based on Book 10 of the Metamorphoses, was published in pamphlet form without any official objection. Indeed, the poem was entered into the Stationers' Register with a notice that it had been authorised by the Archbishop of Canterbury on April the 18th, 1593. Given the profoundly erotic nature of the poem, as well as Queen Elizabeth's proclamation of the same year ordering a crackdown on the publication of material deemed unseemly for Christian ears, it is hard to believe that the poem got through what was, albeit sporadically, the very tight apparatus of the censoring ecclesiastical authority. Further, the Order of 1593 followed in the wake of numerous previous attempts to control erotic literature. For example, the Common Council of London passed an ordinance in 1574 aimed at content, what Elizabethans called the matter of the entertainment, the words and doings, especially those that tended toward unchastity and sedition, and such like. Use your imagination for the such like. The Privy Council's order of 1582 had attempted to prohibit the teaching of Ovid in schools. One member of Parliament opined that while an heathen emperor had had the good sense to exile Ovid and his filthy poems, they were now being taught in Christian grammar schools. Had Elizabethan moralists succeeded in banning Ovid from schools, undoubtedly we wouldn't now have Shakespeare as we know him. In 1583, another bill was put forward in Parliament, attempting to ban altogether unprofitable and idle pamphlets, lewd and wanton discourses of love. In light of all this, one might wonder, indeed, if the Archbishop who approved the publication of Venus and Adonis had actually read Shakespeare's poem. One can only assume that he, or more likely his clerical underlings, were more focused on stalling the publication of heretical tracts that posed an explicit threat to established religion than in censoring what was regarded as salacious verse, and I believe that must have been the case. The fact that Venus and Adonis was dedicated to Shakespeare's illustrious patron, Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton, no doubt also helped ease its passage to print. However, that Venus and Adonis escaped the net of censorship should not blind us to the continual pressure on literature to conform to religious morality. One writer indeed argued that there was already ample legislation against seditious texts, but not enough to staunch the tide of what was regarded as perhaps a more insidious form of corruption. I will not speak of books slanderous to the state, pernicious in every way, because there be already enough statutes to lay hold on them. Venus and Adonis was immensely popular and was known as a wanton pamphlet. So what was wanton about it? Of course, any representation of an oversexed, powerful woman might be thought to constitute a satirical glance at the Virgin Queen herself. But Venus and Adonis was also an unapologetically pagan poem about young Adonis who prefers chasing boars to chasing women. He even refuses the blatant and insistent sexual invitations of the goddess of love herself. At one point, she invites him to kiss her bosom and to graze lower where the pleasant fountains lie. Whereas in Ovid, the story is one of the tragic ending of a great love affair between Venus and Adonis, when Adonis is killed in a boar hunting accident, Shakespeare has given the story a humorous twist. Adonis isn't at all interested in Venus, but he does seem rather worryingly interested in the boar, and his death is described as a sexual consummation. "'Tis true, thus was Adonis slain. He ran upon the boar with his sharp spear, who did not whet his teeth at him again, but by a kiss thought to persuade him there, and nuzzling in his flank the loving swine, sheathed unaware the tusk in his soft groin." The risque sexual intimation here makes fun of the well-nigh obsessive concern of Elizabethan moralists in the wake of legislation first enacted in 1534 and often renewed against what was euphemistically termed filthiness with a beast. Beyond legal restrictions and political pressure, however, there were more specific protocols that helped shape literary language. Fundamentally, what enabled Venus and Adonis to escape censure was its genre, its literary category, the little epic. The subjects of this genre were typically mythological. In the political climate of the 1590s, myth was a place of greater safety, where Shakespeare, like his predecessor Ovid, as Heather James has pointed out, could skirt the boundary between the permissible and the licentious. Shakespeare creates the lush, sensual world of sexual license within a very tightly organized verse framework, and he repeats that form in all 1,194 lines of the poem. It is then just as important to remember that Shakespeare embraced the technical restrictions of his craft as it is to be aware of the legal impediments to the practice of it. Comedy, whether in plays or poems, offers a certain license to speak more freely than is afforded by other genres. Shakespeare's most famous tragic character, Hamlet, is not outspoken. We hear quite a lot from him during the course of the play, but his 8 soliloquies are not public declarations. As you will remember, thought was free only to a very limited extent, so we overhear his private meditations. Soliloquies represent freedom of expression in a culture that did not typically condone it. In the court of his wicked uncle Claudius, Hamlet cannot voice his suspicion that the king is a usurper who has murdered his father, or his fear that his mother may have colluded in the regicide. In 1599, the year before Hamlet was written, Sir John Hayward cautioned, "It is a common saying that thought is free, free indeed from punishment of secular laws, except by word or deed it break forth into action. Yet the secret thoughts against the sacred majesty of a prince, without attempt, without endeavor, have been adjudged worthy of death." In the context of the culture at the court, another writer warns that the courtier may freely think whatsoever he pleaseth, for as our English proverb says, thought is free. But let him take heed that he speak not openly what he hath in his heart conceived privily. Despite having been publicly named as Claudius's successor, or perhaps because of it, Hamlet is keenly aware of the limitations on what he can say, and that speech in all its forms can be politically dangerous. I must hold my tongue. Nor is this paranoia on Hamlet's part, since Claudius has arranged for him to be sent to England with a letter ordering his execution. "Arm you, I pray you, to this speedy voyage, for we will fetters put about this fear which now goes too free-footed." This passage is the antithesis of the great poetry of the play, with its flexible verse lines, which are the very hallmarks of Shakespeare's own free speech. Wicked characters in Shakespeare, just like Claudius, always want to chain up language, while good ones invariably wish to release it. The verb to fetter means to shackle the feet, and the other thing to be aware of here is that feet refers to the metrical units of a line of verse. Those 5 alliterative F's around that central word, fetters, work to bind this quasi-personified fear that has been dangerously at large, and that final alliterative, free-footed, which means something like footloose, ironically puts the double lock on it. This is figuratively binding language, and the idea of language as itself potentially an instrument of bondage was in the period pervasive. As Rebecca Lemon has shown in her study of treasonous words, restrictions on speech, the regulation of words, of language, was in fact the central project of mid-16th to mid-17th century England. Little wonder then that early modern England did not possess the concept of free speech in our modern sense as an inalienable right. However, this idea was articulated as an aspect of the rhetorical category, freeness of speech, which existed only in relation to specifically public discourse. Thomas Wilson's popular book, The Art of Rhetoric, 1553, offered the following definition. Freeness of speech is when we speak boldly and without fear, even to the proudest of them, whatsoever we please or have list to speak, in other words, whatever we want to say. Freeness of speech, then, is an especially direct way of speaking, aimed at truthfulness rather than persuasion or entertainment. From the Greeks on, this form of speech was understood as a vital component of counsel. Thus, 4 of Shakespeare's kings, Cymbeline, Henry V, Henry VI, and Henry VIII, all utter the words, "Speak freely," words that are spoken by no other characters in the plays, who instead more often complain about restrictions on what they can say. This type of audaciously free speech is about giving ruthlessly honest counsel to rulers rather than simply flattering them so as not to incite their wrath. Freeness of speech in this sense was a classical code of conduct appropriate only to an elite minority of free male citizens in the Greek world. Women and social inferiors did not share this privilege. In Romeo and Juliet, Juliet implores her father, Capulet, "Good father, I beseech you on my knees, hear me with patience, but to speak a word." His response is predictable. "Speak not, reply not, do not answer me." The matter at hand is, of course, that Capulet wants Juliet to marry the County Paris, but she is already secretly married to Romeo. Enraged by his daughter's refusal, Capulet orders her to proceed with the wedding. "Fettle your fine joints 'gainst Thursday next, or go to Paris with to St. Peter's Church, or I will drag thee on a hurdle thither." This language is instructive because bound to a hurdle, a flat sledge-like frame, was exactly how traitors and heretics were transported, or rather dragged, to Tyburn, and as well as other places of execution. By this, the audience is ready for Juliet to suffer an analogous form of punishment for her attempt to speak freely. Her garrulous nurse makes the bold intervention and tells Capulet that he is wrong to berate his daughter. "I speak no treason. May not one speak?" This line is an important one because it further reminds the audience that disobedience in the household was understood in English common law as petty treason, a lesser form of treason. It wasn't high treason, which could only be committed against a sovereign, but it was treason nonetheless. And the consequences for Juliet do indeed prove deadly. Similarly, for Hamlet, speaking up would cost him his life. The problem of Hamlet's restricted speech, his stifled dissent in the regime of his usurping uncle, is paramount in that play. Unlike some of the characters in Shakespeare's other plays, such as Othello's Iago, whose malevolent speeches alone on stage address the audience in a very direct, downstage way, Hamlet really does seem to be talking to himself. That the audience overhears his self-addressed expressions increases the sense of an inscrutable inner life, what he describes to the prying Rosencrantz and Guildenstern as the heart of my mystery. For all that, there is also a sense of urgency about wanting to disclose and unburden the self by means of unfettered speech. This is especially significant since Hamlet's very first soliloquy ends with the anguish of wanting to speak freely, and yet he is unable to do so within the political context of Elsinore. But break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. While here Hamlet has something in common with Shakespeare's deposed Richard II, who says, "My heart is great, but it must break with silence." Perhaps surprisingly, he has even more in common with Kate, the truculent and voluble character of The Taming of the Shrew. Why, sir, I trust I may have leave to speak, and speak I will. I am no child, no babe, your betters have endured me say my mind, and if you cannot, best you stop your ears. My tongue will tell the anger of my heart, or else my heart concealing it will break, and rather than it shall, I will be free, even to the uttermost, as I please in words. A common proverbial expression was that grief pent up will break the heart, and editorial commentaries on this play invariably associate Kate's lines with the saying, "Light troubles speak, immense troubles are silent." But this is not grief, I would argue. This is rage against the impediments to speech that Kate's new husband endeavours to impose upon her. She is, after all, being deprived of the leave or permission to speak. I trust I may have leave to speak. In Euripides' Phoenician Women, there is a stark articulation of an idea that was also current in early modern Europe, when Jocasta asks her son, "What is the worst thing about being exiled?" He replies, "One thing most of all, he cannot speak his mind." Jocasta is speaking quite literally when she concludes, "This is a slave's lot thou describest, to refrain from uttering what one thinks." Iago echoes a related sentiment when he asserts his right not to speak. He insinuates the falsehood that Desdemona is unfaithful in response to Othello's "What dost thou think?" Bear in mind here that Othello is himself a former slave, yet according to Iago, slaves are free to conceal what they think. Though I am bound to every act of duty, I am not bound to all that slaves are free to utter my thoughts. As Iago continues to plant suspicions about Desdemona, Othello asks him to speak plainly. "What dost thou mean?" "By heaven, I'll know thy thoughts." Iago, "You cannot, if my heart were in your hand, nor shall not whilst it is in my custody." Wickedness, then, clearly consists in the attempt to conceal thoughts, and goodness in the desire to reveal them. In The Taming of the Shrew, Kate has no clandestine motives, and this is important for how we evaluate her as a character. Indeed, Kate's "I will be free even to the uttermost as I please in words" is the most powerful claim to free speech in all of Shakespeare. Kate's speech, of course, is not a soliloquy. She speaks directly to the other characters, and what restricts her speech is her gender, rather than the kind of political predicament by which the Prince of Denmark is hamstrung. Female speech was often regarded as inherently transgressive, and it was all too easy, as Kay Stanton has shown, for voluble or loquacious women to be branded as whores. In Othello, for example, Desdemona, who before his opinion of her was poisoned by Iago, was valued by her husband for her, quote, "free and bounteous mind," and because she, again a quotation, "speaks freely." Accused of infidelity, she is murdered, as she declares, "for my free speech." Language and the particular restraints imposed on it shape and constrain human and especially female identity. When Hamlet welcomes the players to Elsinore, in reference to the actor playing the female role, he asserts, "The lady shall say her mind freely, or the blank verse shall halt for't." This is a sharp contrast to his instructions to the comedians of the troupe. "Let those that play your clowns speak no more than is set down for them." Clowns were notorious then and now for ad-libbing, which comes from ab libitum, the Latin for "to speak as you please." The lady's lines, however, should be, as Polonius says a little later in commendation of Hamlet's own recitation, well spoken, with good accent and good discretion. If the actor does not speak with fluid expression, the verse will sound stilted or out of rhythm. However, there is also a sense that the female character will be allowed free and perhaps uninterrupted speech directly free and perhaps interrupted speech, and Shakespeare collects this freedom of speech directly with poetic fluency. Odd that I stumbled just as I was talking about poetic fluency, but them's the breaks. If she is not given leave to speak freely, the meter of the verse will be lame or halting. Crucially, these lines reference the verse form that Shakespeare used most often in his plays, namely blank verse, which, because it was unrhymed, was described by his contemporary John Florio as at liberty, loose and free, what we in the modern era refer to something similar, free verse. Of course, one of the things we'd all love to know is what Shakespeare, the man himself, thought about free speech. Unfortunately, he didn't testify before Congress or write to the New York Times or post on Twitter. However, in Sonnet 66, there is a complaint of extraordinary candor against restrictions on speech when Shakespeare protests against art made tongue-tied by authority. Now, it is very tempting to read this as Shakespeare's own opinion, but I would caution against that. First, because I don't think Shakespeare could ever afford to be so unguarded. And secondly, because literature itself demands that a poet adopt a persona on account of the fact that there is always a gap, sometimes narrow and sometimes chasm-wide, between the words on the page and the person who penned them. Virginia Woolf also made this point in A Room of One's Own, written in 1928, when she declared that she would make use of all the liberties and licenses of a writer, but that the word I was only a convenient term for somebody who has no real being. This is especially true in relation to the sonnets, where Shakespeare is also entering a tradition emanating from the 14th century Italian poet Francesco Petrarch, so that the speaker of the sonnets both is and is not Shakespeare, his language modulated by and in dialogue with the tropes and figures that have gone before. This is a complicated point because language never entirely belongs to us. It's always pre-owned, never fully and freely authentic. And aware of this, writers nearly always don a mask, which in early modern England may also have served a protective function. We must bear this in mind when looking at Sonnet 66, in which Shakespeare comes perilously close to a direct and overtly political complaint about the suppression of creative speech. The sonnet begins with the line, "Tired with all these, for restful death I cry," and then proceeds to give a list of the social injustices that exhaust him. Among them, deserving people who get nothing and worthless people who get everything, honours given to those who least deserve them, and the virtuous who attain only social disgrace. This is an extraordinarily moving and melancholy poem, beginning with the conventional idea that death offers respite from the exhausting trials and tribulations of life. However, the poet's death wish has not been caused by the inevitable turbulence of life in general, but by particular social and political circumstances. The sonnet conveys through repetition the oppressive burden of the social maladies it enumerates. With each of the 10 successive iterations of the word "and," that weight gets heavier. There is a sense of the unrelenting nature of social ills, which are being itemized like a bill, a reckoning, the awful cost of which is to be paid by the poet. Amid the catalogue of social injustices that take up 11 lines of the sonnet's 14, the most obtrusive complaint is, "and art made tongue-tied by authority." This is not only because it speaks to the political forces that constrict the poet's voice, but also because tongue-tied is what's known in technical terms as a spondee, a metrical foot of 2 stressed syllables, tum-tum, rather than the typical unstressed pattern of titum. You can see why it was given a technical term, because otherwise we would always be saying tum-tum as opposed to titum, and that might not sound so clever. Art in this period could refer to any form of skilled labour, but art in combination with the suppression of speech points dangerously toward the stifled expressions of the muzzled poet himself. This is a society in which the poet doesn't have a voice in the sense of access to political power. Interestingly, voting in county and parliamentary elections occurred by vocal assent of the severely restricted class of electors giving their voices to candidates. It's a world in which the speaker of the sonnet cannot speak up. There is a paradox in this, since the poet describes the restrictions on what he can say, while all the while saying it with exquisite precision. Yet for all that this is a cri de coeur, the sonnet does not end with a rallying cry for resistance. Instead, it ends almost by way of retraction as a love poem, arguing that were the poet to die, he would leave his lover alone. The implication is that in such a corrupt world as the one he has described, love is the only thing worth living for. My final brief example of the restrictions on speech imposed by authority is from King Lear, which is a play about the impossibility both of speaking truth to power and of the powerless speaking their truths. The king demands flattery, even though receiving it will be his ruin. Lear's fool, who has a certain license to speak because he is the court jester, says, you'll remember this line, "I will hold my tongue." And the honest counsellor Kent is ignored and banished. However, the most important character in the play, the one who is most unquestionably tongue-tied by authority, is Cordelia. Her refusal to cooperate with her father's imperious demand that his daughters compete for portions of his kingdom by telling him how much they love him, nonetheless constitutes not only a form of filial disobedience, but also a potentially treasonous act, because he's the king. As her sisters are laying the flattery on with a trowel, the audience hears her perplexed aside. What shall Cordelia speak? Love and be silent? Cordelia realizes that her only ethical choice is to respond to her father with, "Nothing, my lord." Of course, Cordelia does not remain silent. She explains that she refuses the glib and oily art of rhetoric, as she calls it, to appease her father because she is committed to telling him the truth. Why have my sisters husbands if they say they love you all? King Lear explores the possibilities of unfettered speech and implicitly asks, how can a woman speak out without deadly consequences? The answer in this play is that she cannot, and it is no accident that Lear's poignant and tragic delusion is that he can still hear Cordelia speak after she is dead. "Ha, what is't thou sayest?" But at that point, she can literally say nothing. To conclude, the repressive forces that at times impeded Shakespeare's composition are very different from those which we associate with modern systems of censorship. They were, for example, much less uniform and systematic. Shakespeare, like his contemporaries, no doubt, had to dodge, weave, and maneuver around the censorship apparatus of his day. But more important was his expressive capacity in poetry, his way with words, and that, more than anything, endowed Shakespeare with freedom of speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Dympna. That reading of Sonnet 66 was just extraordinary. We have time for questions. Our experience in the room is that if you shout your question out, you can be heard, but we will repeat it from the podium if necessary. The gentleman in the red pullover there.
Thank you very much for a delightful and moving presentation, especially on feminism. Now, you mentioned misunderstood verses. I think the sonnets probably qualifies as the most misunderstood verses ever. Our research group recently solved the riddle of the sonnet because the final sonnet concludes with the great feminist allegory, Mother Nature triumphs over Father Time, which says, as your sonnets here say, is the sensitivities of women is another indicator that Shakespeare is a woman.
That's quite a thesis. I would say, though, that certainly there really is. I mean, it's interesting because some critics have said that Shakespeare is not sympathetic to women, and I really never understand how you can arrive at that viewpoint. I I wouldn't say it literally, but occasionally symbolically, you know, figuratively, I might want to move closer to your argument.
Wasn't it widely accepted in Shakespeare's time that any speech critical of religion or the monarchy was absolutely prohibited? I mean, I thought that was just almost universally accepted.
It's certainly true. You could, you know, you could be sanctioned and punished very severely, but people, of course, say stuff. They just do, and in art, you know, there is a certain sense of license, and especially I think the kind of remarkable thing is that there's this interest in, because of humanism, in the Latin culture of the ancient world. And that world isn't Christian, so it opens up a completely new horizon. And all of the people who've been at these grammar schools established by humanists who are interested in learning and so on, these grammar schools are teaching this pagan poetry, the ideas of pagan philosophers and so on. So it's not that there are no potentially dangerous ideas, and there are even ideas of, you know, they're exposed to the idea of the Roman Republic. Also, they had access to the Bible, you know, which again, the Old Testament certainly is not a Christian document, and it contained things that would have challenged their worldview. So I think to think of them all as locked down in a kind of sort of intellectual homogeneity would be a mistake, but I think you're quite right that the penalties for speaking sedition or heresy could be very sharp indeed. On the other hand, it's occasionally remarkable what people get away with. I mean, it's the sort of two sides of the same of the coin. But here's Shakespeare saying things that I think are, I mean, the Queen obviously saw As You Like It, enjoyed it, but it wasn't printed. So, you know, we have to balance both of these factors.
This lady here.
Hi, I'm a classicist, and I'm actually my advisor for the law on the democracy and the dissension in that. And I'm working on the transgressive speech in Marshall. And I think, I guess my question is about Sonnet 66 and what you said about how, I think maybe I didn't quite understand why it is that you caution us not to read that as his opinion. If he's using,
Yeah, well.
say, his poetic persona as a mask, which is actually what persona means, of course.
Yeah.
Couldn't we read this as him kind of speaking out of both sides of his mouth, if you will, like saying both things at once?
Okay, the question is, why can't you read Sonnet 66 as I'm going to say something you haven't said, but as the straightforward transcription of Shakespeare's own opinion? And the speaker suggested that is Shakespeare speaking out of both sides of his mouth? Absolutely. As I said, he both is and is not Shakespeare. But I'm always really cautious about the sonnets because they are part of a tradition. They're engaged with other kinds of writing, and also there's that sort of strange retraction into the safety of a love poem at the end. But I think that's exactly the case. I want to retain, as I think you do, that space of uncertainty. We don't know whether it is. It's the same with Ovid. This member of the audience works on Marshall. She's a classicist. So you know about this it's an ancient, the persona, the mask is really an important part of the development of literary endeavor. And I think that's why we need to keep both at once and not try and simplify or pin down to the identities of people in the sonnets or even Shakespeare's, and I'm saying this because my students always want to know what's his own opinion. And unfortunately, I never interviewed him, so I don't know. But so I absolutely agree. We want to retain that instability. And I love your expression, both sides of his mouth, because it's this sense of double speak, this constant dual awareness of what you want to express, but the the constraints of genre, of the 40, you've got to get it into 14 lines furthermore, and you don't want to, it's printed in 1609, what possible trouble could that get you into as well? Very good question.
2 more questions, I think. Hello. Hi, Ava.
Yes, thank you. It occurred to me that you spoke about the limitations on free speech that were political in 2 related but distinct ways. And on the one hand, you've got the kind of official guidelines from the censors attached to the court and the church. And on the other hand, you have the socialization of women's speech, which is a somewhat different kind of limitation. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the distinction between those and also how they're related in your view.
Well, I think it's really interesting that Shakespeare uses women and uses, especially in Hamlet, uses the lady, who you remember is a male actor, who's come to Elsinore, who's going to play the lady's role, but that he uses the woman as the figure for free speech, and that Kate is the person who's the biggest champion of it in Shakespeare. So I think he's making that connection there. I think that's where we see the connection in the texts themselves. And that women's speech is particularly dangerous. The other place where I think female speech is important is in, well, it's important obviously everywhere, but there's a special kind of speech, the prophetic speeches of Margaret Queen Margaret in the Henry plays and the history plays. Where women seem to have this capacity, or certain female characters, to see the future because they have known the past. So that's at a very political level. There's just the general belief that women shouldn't speak freely, and that this is, in fact, even innocent women like Desdemona will be indicted for doing something that is regarded as normal and natural. And obviously women did speak. Women, were part of society. They talked, they behaved in normal ways. But that at any particular moment, they could fall afoul of that. And what's very interesting to me is that Shakespeare's own daughter, Susanna, was slandered by a drunk in the village who said that, not in the village, in the town of Stratford actually, but it's like a village, it's so small. He said that she had been unfaithful, she'd been having sex with another man. And it went to the consistory court in Chester, and she was, vindicated. This occurred after Shakespeare's death, but it's symptomatic of the kinds of things that happen to women all the time, that their speech was transgressive, being voluble, being, On the other hand, in riots, you find women who are incredibly voluble. It's not that women are all meek and silent. They're not, and that seems to be why there is the urgency of reiterating this thing, women are meant to be, silent and obedient, because clearly that's simply not how it works. And I would not so readily want to say that isn't political speech. It's politics that is tied to domesticity, but since in the household, petty treason is a microcosm of treason at the level of the state, and the household and the father of the household is a microcosm of the state itself, the necessity that the patriarch of the house keeps the women and the servants, in control, that's seen as the kind of foundation of political order. So there isn't that separation of domus and oikos, household and polity, that I think we get in other kinds of situations. That's a long answer to a very good and very thought-provoking question. Sorry.
I'm going to take one more question. Hi there. Go ahead.
I have a question. I've been reading and saw Michael Woods' Search of Shakespeare, where and Claire Asquith's book, Shadow. And I was kind of expecting that your talk would be more about Shakespeare as a Catholic, and from a Catholic background, having to hide his speaking Could you speak to that?
Yes, that was a question about Shakespeare's Catholicism, or alleged Catholicism. The thing I think to remember about Shakespeare is that, like everybody else, he had Catholic grandparents, because everybody did. Everybody came from a Catholic family, because until the 1530s, there were no other options. And I would say it's not just, Protestantism that people in this period are being exposed to. Because of that humanist education, they're being exposed to pagan thought, the thought of Greece and Rome. They're also being exposed to Jewish thought. And in fact, Henry VIII, when he's trying to figure out his divorces, is actually interested in bringing scholars of Hebrew to England. So they're exposed to that other kind of religious difference. So again, I could not put my hand on heart and say that Shakespeare is a Catholic. Michael Woods is suspicious of Shakespeare as the author of his plays in a way that, in my view, is without warranty and without evidence. Claire Asquith's book, Shadow Play, was inspired by the fact that she went to Prague before the end of the Cold War and felt that actors were speaking in code because there were things that they couldn't say. And I understand the impetus, to see that censorship maybe would cause you to speak in code. But the thing is, but Shakespeare's literary writings are not to be decoded. That's not the end of it. There are certainly allusions. There's certainly, you could almost go either way with the religious issues when you examine the works. I think he's really circumspect about religion. There's not really, I don't think you can show a hand either way. Old Hamlet comes from Purgatory, which is a Catholic place, but then, it was a place everybody knew because their grandparents might be still in it, And I think it was, and I say this as a card-carrying Catholic, it was only a couple of years ago that limbo was abolished, the place that unbaptized people go. And I think, how can you abolish limbo? It was a real theological dilemma for me because I couldn't quite figure out how it would work. But I think she just is over-reading this. First of all, you decide what Shakespeare is, and then you read to prove it. And I don't want to do that, I think. I feel I want to. But what's very valuable about the work of both Michael Wood and Claire Asquith is that Claire Asquith certainly brought more attention to religion, along with other writers, including, people in the room here like Lorianne Farrell, that Shakespeare was not somebody who, was immune to the Reformation, and that we can see religious imagery and figurations throughout the work. So I think that that's a valuable historical contribution, but I don't agree with the conclusion. I feel I can't know Shakespeare's religious beliefs, and in a way, nor do I want to. Because that would mean that my interpretations of his work, I think, would become narrower. And so often, what bothers me about all that is that so often people are reading, for Shakespeare the man instead of what he wrote. And the beginning of the first folio, Ben Jonson says, look not on his picture, but his book. And so that's where I want to go back to time and time again. So again, I feel those arguments have made a contribution, as has the work of Ernest Honigman and Richard Wilson around religion. But I think that Claire Asquith and Michael Wood just go way too far, from my opinion. But it's an important. It reminds us that religion is really important, and they'd had this cataclysmic change. That in one lifetime, I think Cardinal Allen says, first of all, we were Catholic, then we were Protestant, then we were back Catholic again, and then we were Protestant again. Of course, that was hugely, hugely significant, and any reminder of that, I think, is always valuable.
Thank you. So I find it quite reassuring that even though Dympna didn't get the chance to interview Shakespeare, she wouldn't have wanted to anyway. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your consistent support of our programs. Please join us outside for coffee, cookies, and Prosecco. Please join me in thanking Dympna Callaghan. Awesome.
You know what put me off at that point was the lights kept going up and down, and it